All right, welcome back to the JFK assassination and assassination audit. Excuse me. It is 28 August. This is video number 81, and we're going to go back into Maurice Bishop, Mr. Phillips, whatever his name is of the day, and go over his testimony before the House Select Committee on Assassinations. And the first word is confused. He's faking being confused. He's leaving them being confused. So we're all confused here. But this is a master script on how to answer questions by not answering. And he is a master at this. All right, so I'll just start from the top. Confused. I don't recall, he said, but I won't tell you the other person. I won't tell you the other person's name. Mr. Sprague. Well, did you just say that he said he didn't want to confuse you? Mr. Phillips. I'm not sure that is an accurate quote for the word. Mr. Sprague. Well, let me ask you this. Did his call to you in the context of indicating that they had checked the name and that the person appears to have worked there make you a little more questioning about your own recollection? Mr. Phillips. No, sir, because my original thinking of the man's name was simply translator, who I knew in Mexico, not in the context of translator who, not in the context of the Oswald translator. Mr. Sprague. But did his call have any effect in making you a little more questioning about your entire recollection of this matter? No, sir. I think no. All right. What else was then said in the call other than what you have just said? I don't recall anything else, sir. In regard to Miller, the Miller call, have you related it in its entirety? Yes, sir. It was brief. Mr. Sprague, well, I know what you said. Is there anything you admitted from the call? Yes. There was another thing he said. Something about contacting your staff. He said who was contacting? He said he was contacting the staff? He said something about he would be calling your staff or something like that. Did he say for what purpose? No, sir. He said he would be calling. I don't think he mentioned a name, someone on your staff, and I presume he was going to say, I spoke to Mr. Phillips, and we know he's coming down. He said, if I have anything else to tell you, I will call you before 4 o'clock, and he did not call. So also, let me explain something that's going on here. So Mr. Phillips was involved with this rogue right-wing group within the CIA, just like there were rogue right-wing groups in the Secret Service and the FBI, just like there are today. And also, they were mixed up with the right-wing Nazis and Klan members, anti-Castro Cubans, CIA Special Forces mercenaries, who were all sympathetic to getting rid of Castro. And all also, in the same vein, either thought JFK was too weak or completely too liberal, even in bed with the communists. It goes from that range, from being too weak to all the way over to being in bed with the communists here. So when you have this group coalesce together, they're working for the same goal, is to get rid of Kennedy. Now, some don't want to participate. They're for getting rid of Kennedy, but don't want to participate in the conspiracy. Others are for getting rid of Kennedy. They don't want to participate in the killing but they're either going to look the other way or allow certain things to go on and happen and not report those things to the proper authorities. Then there are other active agents inside the CIA. So let me also just make it really clear. There was no one in the CIA that was involved in on the ground in Dallas or pulling the trigger to kill Kennedy. All the people that killed Kennedy were Cubans, Nazi types, and mafia figures. Okay? They were getting... So what you could have is CIA support around that. And this support goes all the way to Mr. Phillips, who helped sheep dip Oswald, getting him into Mexico with the help of Mr. Osborne, and sending him on a mission to the Cuban Russian embassy to make himself look crazy and desperate, to try to get into Cuba, to try to get into Russia, so he could come back and kill the president, as if any of that makes any fucking sense. But they're looking at it from later on, when someone is investigating, they'll say, oh, well, this makes sense, because Oswald was trying to get into Cuba. He was passing out flyers for Cuba. So that means he's sympathetic to Castro. Therefore, Oswald killed Kennedy. Therefore, Oswald was working with the Cubans and vis-a-vis the Russians. So let's go invade Cuba. This will give us an excuse to invade Cuba. And who's in charge of the entire anti-Cuban project in the CIA for the entire Western Hemisphere but Mr. Phillips in Mexico City? And again, we have testimony of him meeting with Oswald in Dallas. There's a CIA agent or contract agent in New Orleans helping him get his visa to Mexico City. There's another right-winger extremist involved in shepherding Oswald from Laredo down to Mexico City. And on the same day that Phillips becomes head of the anti-Castro Cuban organization operations of the CIA in Mexico City, is the same day that Oswald shows up in Mexico City. It's also the same day they put a pulse camera on the front gate, or monitoring the front gate of the Cuban embassy. So what you have here is rogue elements, right-wing elements, working within the CIA, using its infrastructure, just like in the FBI and the Secret Service and in the military, without the authorization of the uppy-ups, the upper persons, okay? And so what you have here in the 1970s, and it's been happening ever since they first found out, they did an internal investigation in 1964, that rogue elements of their own organization were involved in killing the President of the United States and using the organization's infrastructure to do that. So the first priority of any organization, of any group, is protect your own ass. Not find justice, not, go in and take out these guys and bring them to the authorities and say, here, we found out these guys were involved and used in our organization and they killed the president. No. Their priority is to preserve the organization. Therefore, they have to protect the people involved and help cover that up. And they're doing that even up to today to protect the organization and keep it intact. Okay? And this is something that the right-wing elements of the CIA and the FBI, they counted on this. They knew that this organization wouldn't go along with what they were doing, but they would definitely cover it up to protect their own ass. Okay? So this is why the attorney's calling Mr. Phillips to remind him that, hey, we protected your ass, so don't go cutting a deal and leaving us out to dry. Because you're still under oath. You're still under your obligation, your security clearance. This is what they're doing. They're trying to protect their ass to make sure Mr. Phillips isn't going to go rogue on them also again. And Mr. Phillips is playing both sides. He's toying with the CIA, saying, hey, I'm just going to tell them everything and cover my ass. And if they offer me immunity, I'm just going to take it and let them know that you guys covered it up. Yeah, I was involved, but you guys went along and covered it up. So that's what's going on here. Are we okay? This is what that phone call's about. Hey, Mr. Phillips, are we good? Are we okay? Are we good to go here? Or is there anything else we need to know? This is what's going on here, and he's playing a pretty clever game here. Because he knows that the CIA is watching this whole interrogation committee meeting. He knows they're watching. Okay? So anyway, we'll keep going. And another thing I love about CIA speak, or spook speak, I guess you could say, is they never say anything assertive. It's always, I think, or I seem to recall, things like that. It's never, I definitely heard this, I saw that. Nothing in the absolute. Because this way, if they're caught lying, they can go back and say, well, I think I remember that, but I didn't recall that. But now that you've reminded me, now I do remember that was the situation. That was what he said. See, it's a very clever way of lying without lying. Or lying, and then if you get caught, you can easily go back and correct it without being, going to jail. Can you give that a little thought? I had just shortly been contacted by Mr. Feeney. Mr. Feeney, name was the only one I knew. Sir, I will try to. I can't think of it. I'm not positive that he did mention a name, but he said, I will be contacting the staff. You see? So he says he thinks they're going to contact Mr. Feeney, and then he says, I'll try to remember, and then he says, I'm not positive, but I think that was the name. This is all bullshit. And sometimes they do it, they're so good at it, that they do it unnecessarily, on trivial things. This is how you can tell you have a congenial liar. Other than news media, did anyone else attempt to contact you, and in fact contact you once this story broke in the Post regarding the story and your appearance before the subcommittee, other than these people from the CIA? Mr. Phillips, no sir, other than the news media. Now going back, when these intercepts occurred, who was it responsible for making the transcripts from the tapes? Was it the same unit that was responsible for the intercepts? Certainly in the case of the Spanish ones, they were made in the unit where they were received, and those transcripts then came into the station. And in the case of conversations in the Russian language, as best as I can recall it, they came into the station, and I was wondering last night whether it was a little unit outside, but I don't recall that there was. There may have been a translator outside, and then they were once again taken out of the station of the Soviet translator. But as I understood it, there was no Soviet language experts in that unit outside, but in the station, yes. Good Lord. Just so I understand this, when you distinguish between Spanish and Russian, yes sir, you are not distinguishing in terms of the place that is intercepted, but the conversation that is on the interception. Is that correct? That is correct. And that makes sense because you're going to have a technical location operated by technicians, and then they're going to take those tapes and hand them to the people that are going to be translating them. So, and this intercept operation, if I can use the word, was not only intercepting the conversation that were at the Cuban embassy and the consul, was that operation also intercepting conversations at the Russian embassy and consul. That is correct, sir. And so I understand it. In either situation, Spanish conversations will be translated in type right there where the intercept operation was, wherever that may have been. That is where I understood it, but I never visited it. And the Russian conversations, that was picked up whether at the Cuban or the Russian embassies, was taken to somewhere in the embassy itself where it was then translated and typed up. Is that correct? That is correct. It may have been that some of the Russian things then went out to a Russian translator who actually worked outside. I don't know that that was the case. All right. Let's deal at the moment with the Russian part of that. So things are so much simpler now because they have audio files and stuff, so you could have a bunch of guys up at the NSA up in Washington getting direct feed from whatever these bugs or whatever they're monitoring of the Russians. And that would make it where you'd have less staff you would need in actually Mexico City. Do you know who the translator in the embassy to translate these intercepts that involve the Russian language? I do not recall, sir. In that name that you were stating yesterday, to whom Mr. the CIA agent, the name of Mr. George Misko, I was stating was the only name of the Russian translator I remember. And actually it was George Misko and his wife. When you were talking about the translator of the Russian conversation, yes, sir. Yes, sir. And what is the person's name? George Misko. This is the phonetic. I'm not sure how it's pronounced. That is the phonetic. I'm not sure how it is pronounced. So, the phonetic will be how it's pronounced. Okay? Anyway. First, the translator, do you know who was the typist for the translator of those intercepts? Mr. Phillips, I do not recall the names. I recall 2 women, American, who were local employees. That is, they were not sent from Washington, but were hired locally. I didn't know them personally, but perhaps her husband was in business or something like that. And since foreign nationals were not allowed into the office, they did come in and work on the contract basis, but not a regular U.S. government employee. And I can't remember their names, but I recall 2 of them. Do you have any recollection of the first names, nicknames, last names, or any of the typists of the intercepts? Not at all at this time. I could recognize the photographs, but I can't remember their names. I will try to. All right, now, going back to the Spanish intercepts, do you know who was the translator of the Spanish intercepts? So Spanish intercepts would be covering the Cuban embassy. Okay? No, sir. Do you know who any of the typists were? No, sir. Now, let me ask you this. When a conversation is intercepted, was there any procedure for dealing more immediately with the conversation that the listener that was listening at the same time thought was a little more important than just a normal intercept? Just answer first yes or no. Yes. And what was the procedure? as I recall it, a telephone call to someone in the CIA station from the place saying, hey, we have something terribly interesting here. Now, would that be made by the monitor himself, or would he report that to somebody else who would then make the decision to do something for more immediacy? Sir, I don't know. When the telephone call that you have alluded to was made, as far as you know, to whom would that be made? So, what he's talking about, or what the questioner is talking about, is if they hear on there that on the Spanish conversation the Cuban says the bomb is going to go off in Miami at 3 o'clock on Sunday the 24th, and it's the 23rd, well, they're immediately going to expedite that tape and that translation to the proper authorities there. Okay, so this is more gobbledygook. I'm on page 40 of 139 pages, and I've done, about 5 videos on this section. So I think from now on what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn the camera off, and I'm going to read, and when I find something interesting, I'll turn it back on. That seems to make more sense. Alright, I'm going to go back and read this at another time separate, but I'm going to go back to this Ask 193 Oswald in Mexico City video, and we'll go for that to the end of the hour. So this one's really interesting again. This guy right here was head of Soviet counterintelligence at the Soviet embassy in Mexico City. This is his translator, American translator. I guess he was assigned by the book company, but this guy is actually an informant for the FBI. This is Mary Farrell, really good researcher. There's the moderator, and I'm not sure who these people are here. They're some authors and stuff, but this guy's got some really good insights. He gave basically a blow-by-blow of what happened when Oswald came to the this Russian embassy. He was crying, he was desperate, highly agitated, shouting, and he even produced a pistol, which he placed on the counter there. They somehow got the pistol out of his hand. I don't know how he would have got a pistol inside the damn embassy, but anyway. So that's what's going on there. And it's very interesting. I don't know. I just find the direct sources much more interesting than some author telling me what happened.
Description of this call appeared in other days when Oswald was in the United States.
Yes, after he had returned to the United States.
Yeah.
Moving right along to the next part of this, Duran reminded Oswald that the transit visa could not be issued until he supplied her with a visa from the country of final destination, in this case Russia, so Oswald departed again, presumably bound for the Russian embassy. In the afternoon, perhaps as late as 5 p.m., Oswald returned without the visa from the Russians, but with assurances to Duran that the Russians had agreed to supply the visa.
Again, this whole scenario doesn't make any fucking sense if you stop for a minute and think about it. Okay? Oswald goes to Mexico City, goes to the Cuban embassy so he can get a visa to get into Cuba so he can transit back to Russia. So then he can go back to the United States and kill the President of the United States. It doesn't make any fucking sense. And the Warren Commission just throws it in here like, yeah, this proves that Oswald was in bed with the Russians and the Cubans and or was doing it. I think the Warren Commission came to the conclusion that Oswald was doing it to prove his loyalty to Russia and Cuba, but it doesn't make any sense if you listen to people how Oswald talks about Russia after he gets back. He says it's a mess, that it's no better than the United States. He's not a big fan of Russia, okay? And so then they're trying to make it like, oh, he's moved on, and he thinks that Cuba is the cat's meow, and that's why he wants to get into Cuba. Well, it doesn't make any sense again if he's trying to get into Cuba so he can come back and kill the president. So, but again, what they're trying to do, the Warren Commission is trying to stamp out fires because it's following the order of the president to not be forced into war with Cuba and Russia. Okay? But the right-wingers, the right-wing elements who set up this whole assassination are trying to put the responsibility of the assassination at the doorstep of Castro. Therefore, Johnson will have, because of the public will and outrage, would have no choice but to invade Cuba. And then, Johnson, who wasn't a fan of Kennedy, but also is not a fan of starting World War III, is trying to stop that and just lay the blame just at Oswald and say that he was, crazy. And so that's where this whole scenario comes about. What it is, it's a retranslation of what actually happened. We were just reading about Phillips. It was Phillips that came up with this whole scenario. You even hear him talk about him here. To get Oswald into Mexico City, he set up this whole thing with Gadet getting him the visa in New Orleans, and Osborne, this right-winger, escorting him down to Mexico City. It was Phillips who was trying to set the whole scenario at the doorstep of Castro for the assassination. So that tells you there's a plot involved that triggers and goes right into effect right after right after Kennedy decides he's coming to Dallas. Then all these things start to click in. Okay, they've already got Oswald arrested at the beginning of August for passing out the free play for Cuba flyers. Okay, and like I said, they've got Oswald in New Orleans. He can easily transit to Miami or Tampa or Atlanta or Houston or Austin or Dallas. He's the guy for the South, okay? He can easily, wherever Kennedy decides to go, that's where they can send Oswald to work and to be there, to be the patsy. There's another guy, may even been Nagel, out in California, that we don't hear about as much, that's doing the same. They're setting him up. And then there's this other guy up in Chicago. There's probably another guy in the New York area, but the guy in Chicago could easily go to New York also. So they've got their bases covered as they're trying to figure out where Kennedy's going to go so they can get him. They already had a Miami plot, but all that didn't work out. They weren't able to get Oswald into that area, and then it was thwarted also. So they do this grand scenario to get Oswald sheep-dipped as this communist, okay? So they've got him, just think about New Orleans. They've got him working right around the corner from Bannister at the Riley Coffee Company. He gets fired from Riley Coffee Company. He's passing out flyers for the free play for Cuba movement. That gets him some notoriety. He's on the radio station. He's on TV briefly and locally in New Orleans. Then he's out there in, Clinton, Louisiana, trying to register to vote against CORE. Okay. And he's trying to get a job in the state mental hospital. He's out there trying to get a haircut. All these people see Oswald, and it makes him seem like he's crazy, okay? Then, as soon as it's found out that Kennedy is going to be coming to Dallas, Ruth Paine goes, right around this time, Ruth Paine is in D.C. listening. She says she's in D.C. listening to Martin Luther King's speech. I think she's picking up more orders. Then around this time in August, or the end of August, um, beginning of September, Kennedy decides he's going to Texas and going to Dallas. So that's when Ruth Paine comes back from D.C. She swings down to New Orleans. She picks up Oswald because Oswald's been told, hey, we're moving you back to Dallas, okay? We got a job there for you. We're going to move you back to Dallas. So he thinks he's going to go back to Dallas, but first, we've got an assignment for you to make some money, okay? So, and think about all this. Oswald got fired on August 3rd, but the end of September, 2 months, he's been on unemployment. But somehow he's managed to pack all his things and into Ruth Paine's car. Ruth Paine just happens to swing through right at the right time to bring him back to Dallas. Ruth Paine loads the rifle, broken down, wrapped up in a blanket, but doesn't recognize it as a rifle. Her husband unloads the vehicles. That means because, 8-month pregnant Marina is not going to be unloading the vehicle. So Ruth Paine's husband is unloading the vehicle. So there's no way in hell he could, what is this wrapped in a blanket? There's a rifle here, okay? There's no way he wouldn't have known about the rifle, okay? There's also indications that Michael Paine, Ruth Paine's husband, is the one that's going around, because he does have his own rifle, going around to the rifle range imitating Oswald, going out and testing cars, imitating Oswald, leaving the name as Oswald, okay? So Oswald, all he knows is he's following orders. He can make a little extra money. Here, go down to Mexico City. What we want to do is we're testing out our new communication systems. We want to figure out how the Russians and the Cubans are communicating back from Mexico City back to their home countries. So we want you to go down there, act crazy, try to get a visa or pretend like you're trying to get a visa and shake up things. He's a stringer. They send him out there to shake up things. All he knows is he's getting paid and he's doing his duty, okay? And so that's what he does. He goes down there, he plays the crazy person, he brings his gun, okay? He doesn't really know a lot about getting there, so they get another contract agent in New Orleans, Cadet, to go down and help him get his visa. Cadet gets a visa. He's right in line with Oswald. At first he says he doesn't know Oswald, and then later he's complaining about Oswald's a loser, and he knew him and he just wanted money. And then you got another CIA contractor getting paid by the CIA, a Cuban, who sees Oswald in Dallas while the guy's going into a meeting with David Phillips, Maurice Bishop. He sees Oswald coming out. Oswald gets on the bus or is driven down to Laredo, where he's handed off to this Albert Osborne, who spends a lot of time down in Mexico City. He's definitely right-wing, kind of older guy. John Birch Society, all these kinds of things. He's running like a fake missionary. The FBI is so interested in this guy, they spent hundreds of man-hours trying to figure out who this guy is, Albert Osborne, and what's his relationship to Oswald. Also, on the day of the assassination, November 22nd, Albert Osborne has gone back to his home country of the UK. He's in Grimsley visiting his brother and sister. He wanted to have an alibi, okay? But in Grimsley, a few hours before the assassination, the local newspaper there gets a phone call from a phone booth in Grimsley, right down the road from where Albert Osborne's brother and sister live. And the newspaper is told to watch the headlines coming out of Dallas in the next couple hours. The FBI was so intrigued by this, they asked for Scotland Yard to go and interview Albert Osborne's brother and sister. Albert Osborne had a farm near Knoxville. Now, in Knoxville, there is this, or close to Knoxville, I believe, there is this, what's it called? A place that's part of the bomb manufacturing, the nuclear bomb. And it's a factory. You can go on a tour, and there's a guest book. And in that guest book, I think a couple of weeks before the assassination, is the name Lee Harvey Oswald. So someone has signed Lee Harvey Oswald's name into a book in Knoxville a few weeks before the assassination. Just happens to be the same place that Albert Osborne has his farm. Okay? And so Albert Osborne, he's this minister supposedly, and he goes around to churches raising funds and going around these right-wing circles raising funds for these churches in Mexico City, but doesn't seem to spend very much time with these churches in Mexico City, even though he goes to Mexico like every month or so. So Albert Osborne spotted on the bus all the way down from Laredo to Mexico City by these Australian girls and other passengers on the bus. The FBI was so intrigued with that they asked the equivalent of the FBI in Australia to go and interview these girls. And they said that Osborne and Oswald got on the bus together, sat together, had conversations the whole 12-hour trip, and then got off together and went off together in the same direction. So it's obvious that Oswald was being shepherded around by this Osborne guy. Also, another thing that the FBI went, and while they were interviewing the printing company that did the Free Pay for Cuba flyers with the 544 Camp Street address, they said, well, they showed a picture of Oswald, and they said, did Oswald come in and pay for this? And they checked their records, and the records said that no, it wasn't someone named Oswald. It was someone, the order was ordered and paid for by an older man named Osborne. And they thought that was a mistranslation. Are you sure it's not Oswald? And he said, no, he signed it right here, Osborne. And they talked to the employee that took the order, and they said, yeah, it was an older man, an elderly man named Osborne with a slight non-American accent, a British accent. So you've got Osborne in New Orleans paying for the Free Pay for Cuba flyers and ordering them for Oswald also. Okay? And then you've got David Phillips is probably the one coordinating all of this. He's sending out his CIA assets to shepherd Oswald so they can get him. Also, while Oswald is in Mexico City, and I believe it was Oswald in Mexico City, they wouldn't have gone to all that effort not to send him down there. There was it Sylvia Duran? Or am I mixing up names here? Anyway, there was a woman in Dallas who said that some Cubans who were anti-Castro showed up with a white guy who was, she said, later on identified as Oswald, and said he went by the name of Leon Oswald. And he was an ex-Marine, and he was anti-communist, and he hated Kennedy, but you never know, he could go either way, right or left. And later, she got a call from this Cuban and ask her what she thought about Leon Oswald. And she thought that was kind of odd. And she remembers the dates because there was some kind of Catholic priest conference going on right around the same time. And that's how she was able to pin the dates, and they found out from those dates that Oswald was in Mexico City. And then you see Lieberler, the lawyer from the Warren Commission, try to totally discredit this woman and her sister, like they made it up, or they didn't see Oswald, or something to discredit them. So you've got, I mean, think about this. For one guy, you've got Osborne ordering and making and paying for the flyers in New Orleans. You got Gadet, a CIA contractor, helping Oswald get his visa to Mexico City. You've got this guy in Dallas seeing Oswald coming out of his meeting with Maurice Bishop, his CIA contact. You've got these Australian girls and other people seeing Albert Osborne on the bus with Oswald all the way to Mexico City. You've got this woman in Dallas, these two Cubans come by with a guy named Leon Oswald and trying to pass him off as Oswald while Oswald's in Mexico City. You've got Albert Osborne just happens to be back in the UK on the date of the assassination. And then there's that call from the phone booth right down the street from his brother and sister's home to the newspaper, telling them to watch the headlines coming out of Dallas in the next couple of hours. And then, of course, you've got Oswald's signature at that museum near Knoxville where Osborne lived. So the FBI spent hundreds of man hours chasing this guy down. Also, Osborne was even in front of the FBI, because the FBI, they'd have a team interviewing him in Texas and a team interviewing him in Tennessee and then a team interviewing him in New Orleans and another team interviewing him in Georgia, wherever they could find him or stop him, okay? And at different locations, he said he was a different person. He had assumed the name of another missionary that was close to his age that had died a few years before. So why all the mysterious intrigue? He finally admitted it, that because when the FBI interviewed him in Tennessee, he would pretend like he's this other missionary and say, yeah, I know Albert Osborne, he's a good guy and all this kind of stuff and da-da-da-da-da. And then they'd interview Albert Osborne in Georgia and he says, yeah, I'm Albert Osborne and I know that other missionary and he's a good guy and da-da-da-da-da. And then he'd switch in New Orleans, he'd switch in Dallas. So he had to admit that, yeah, I'm the same guy you've been talking to at these different locations. Why all the intrigue? Why all the lying? So eventually the FBI, and I think it's directly from the orders of Hoover, because the FBI agents are going to do their job they're trained to do. They're going to spend all this time interviewing, and then the station chief is going to say, go out and interview this guy again, let's find out some more information. And they don't know what the hell's going on, and they're going to report that back to headquarters. So I think after a while, between Mark Felt and J. Edgar Hoover and his little lover there, they decide to shut down this investigation on Osborne. Because if they keep digging, they're going to find Osborne's connections to these right-wing groups, the John Birch Society, all these things. and the Cubans. So they shut it down, and we're going to read over these papers, and after you see the FBI spend 6 months, 7 months, hundreds of hours, they're paying agents to go out and interview people, drive out there in cars and gas and hotels and stuff like that. All of a sudden, this whole thing just gets shut down right before the Warren Commission final report comes out. And there's nothing more in the FBI files about Osborne at all. So I find that interesting. There's no conclusion paper like they usually have, a summary paper that says, well, even though it was just all coincidence that Osborne was at the same place as Oswald, we don't think he had anything to do with the assassination because of this, that, and this. But there's none of that. It just shuts down. So what that tells you is that the upper people, like Hoover, shut down that investigation. Okay? Anyway, so we'll keep going. And I just find the whole thing with Osborne, Oswald, and Phillips about Mexico City very fascinating, because it basically gives teeth and proves that there was a conspiracy, that it wasn't just a lone nut.
Forthwith, Duran called the Russian embassy to confirm Oswald's status. Speaking in Spanish, she went over the problem and was informed that the visa had to come from Moscow and would not be issued for at least 4 months. Duran claimed that she alone conversed with the Russians. She advised Oswald of what she had been told. Oswald grew obstinate and began raising his voice. She retreated to the office of Consul.
Oh yeah, that was the name. So it was Sylvia Duran, was a Mexican citizen who dealt with Oswald at the Cuban embassy. It was Sylvia Odio, who was a Cuban that lived in Dallas, where they came by, where these anti-Castro Cubans came by with this guy named Leon Oswald. Also, I forgot to mention this part, while Oswald supposedly on his way to Mexico City, you have this party in New Orleans that goes on with David Ferry and Shaw and a few other people and Cubans. And there's this Leon Oswald again, okay, that is, you know, they're all sitting there talking about killing Kennedy in a triangulation crossfire, okay? Personally, I go along with what Garrison was trying to say, is that Kerry Thornley was the person imitating Oswald in that area, because Kerry Thornley went from Los Angeles right around the same time, through Mexico City, ended up in New Orleans living with a person just literally right down the street from Shaw, okay? So there was some kind of connection there. And then when Oswald comes back to Dallas, Thornley ends up, what, in D.C. as a doorman or something like that, at a hotel or a condominium. So Kerry Thornley was either used or willingly participated in imitating Oswald. Maybe he didn't know that they were going to frame Oswald for killing the president. Maybe, you know, they were just paying him money, and he's like, yeah, I know about Oswald. You know, it's interesting that Kerry Thornley actually ends up in Atlanta, where I was at, and I had no idea that he lived there in Atlanta, and lived in Five Points, this little bohemian type area of Atlanta. Matter of fact, I'm going to put the Kerry Thornley in my little topics here. But anyway, so we'll keep going.
As Quay, and informed him of the problems with the Americans. Asquith went to Duran's office and tried to reason with Oswald, but the angry American wasn't having it. He had to get to Cuba within the next 3 days. The projected delay was an example of petty bureaucracy. He was a friend of the Cuban Revolution, and on at the top of his lungs. Asquith soon tired of this and told him to leave. In her testimony to the House Assassinations Committee staffers, in volume 3 of page 6 through 119, Duran presents the following contradictions to the official version of Oswald at the Cuban embassy. On the one hand, she was quite certain that the photo attached to the visa application and a November 23rd newspaper photo of Oswald, the man she saw on television coverage from Dallas, depicted the same person who visited the embassy on Friday, September the 27th. During the questioning by Mexican authorities just after the assassination, however, Duran described Oswald as, quote, short and blonde. The House Assassinations Committee's Mexico City report establishes that the CIA omitted that part of her description from the translation provided to the Warren Commission. In 2 subsequent memos to the Warren Commission, the agency corrected this deletion, which is a Commission document 426, page 4. The first memo didn't reach the Commission staff until January the 31st. By that time, the Warren Commission seemed immune to the discrepancy in Duran's description of Oswald. The other major contradiction in her identification of Oswald occurred during her deposition in front of the House Assassinations Committee's group that went down to interview her. Quote, blue eyes, almost green. Blonde hair, almost white. Height about equal to her own. She was 5 foot 3.5 tall. Weight equal to that of one of her interrogators, Edwin Lopez, who weighed at the time 119 pounds. Oswald, she claims, spoke to her in English with a trembling voice and seemed pathetic. On the original record of Lee Harvey Oswald's enlistment in the Marine Corps, it notes that he had hazel eyes. In 1963, the data on his June 25, 1963 passport application indicates he had gray eyes, brown hair, and was 5 feet 11 inches tall. His weight on an employment application dated October the 15th, 1963, was 150 pounds, height 5 foot 9 inches tall. His fingerprint identification card following his arrest in New Orleans indicated brown eyes, 5 foot 9 inches tall, and a weight of 136 pounds. His death certificate on November the 25th, 1963, listed his height as 5 foot 9 inches, weight 131 pounds, blue eyes. During an appearance before the House Assassinations Committee in Washington, retired Cuban consular official Asquith told his version of the Oswald visit to the embassy. He had general recall of 3 visits, but was uncertain if they all occurred on the same day. He stated that the consulate was open from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m., Monday through Friday, and he was quite sure that no one was received there after hours. He was confident that his replacement, Senor Mirabal, saw Oswald on at least 1 and possibly all 3 occasions of his visits to the embassy. Here is Asquith's description of Oswald. Quote, over 30 years of age and very thin face, deeply lined, blonde, dark blonde hair. In referring to the pictures of Oswald on the visa application, he stated, quote, 15 years had gone by, so it is very difficult for me to be in a position to guarantee it in a categorical form. But my belief is that this gentleman was not, in fact, the person or the individual who went to the consulate. In direct contradiction to Duran's recollection, Asquith was quite certain that the clothes worn by the man who came to the embassy were not the same clothes worn by the man in the photograph attached to the visa, which confirms what Colonel Nechaparenko told us. Although Asquith's replacement, Mirabal, saw Oswald only fleetingly, in his testimony before the House Assassinations Committee, he identified Lee Harvey Oswald as the man he saw inside the Cuban embassy. An important addendum to Oswald's alleged activities in Mexico City can be found in Anthony Summers' memorable book Conspiracy. In it, Summers zeroes in on Oscar Contreras. This former law student at the Mexico City University was still a fixture in 1963 with left-wing sentiments. Unlike students in the U.S., it is not uncommon for former students to have a continued presence on the campus. Contreras recalled an evening in late September when he and several of his leftist student friends were lounging in a campus cafeteria. A stranger approached them and introduced himself as Lee Harvey Oswald, a name which he promptly spelled. He was having trouble, he told them, getting to Cuba and wondered if the students might be able to help him to get a visa. A friend of Contreras's, who was well acquainted with the people who worked at the Cuban embassy, including Consul Azcue, that evening spoke with Azcue on Oswald's behalf. Azcue and the Cuban intelligence officer warned Contreras to break off contact with Oswald. They were suspicious of this American. They interpreted his behavior at the consulate as the work of an agent provocateur intent on infiltrating left-wing groups.
There you go. You hear that? So even the Cubans understood what Oswald's purpose was, okay? That he was there to shake up things, to provoke things, and, you know, Oswald didn't realize that's what he was doing. He was being used as a ringer to shake things up. So then they would all start reporting back to Moscow and to Havana, and then they could monitor them and figure out the chain of command and who's in charge, things like that.
Contreras described Oswald as more than 30 years old, short, 5 foot 6 inches. Additional thoughts which Contreras shared with Summers have importance. Nothing about the students' conversation in the cafeteria included references to Cuba. How then was it possible for the stranger calling himself Oswald to be aware of the political sympathies of Contreras and his friends and of Contreras' contacts inside the Cuban embassy? This encounter had to be the result of coaching by someone in a position to know of that relationship.
And there you go. So Maurice Bishop is going to tell Oswald, look, we know of this student group at this, you know, that has Cuban sympathies at this university. Go there and try to get, if you can't get the visa, go there and try to get an endorsement from them so you can get that visa. So that tells us another indication that Oswald has intelligence, training, or handling. It's all over Oswald. But poor Oswald has no idea what he's being suckered into. He's just doing his patriotic duty. They're sending him down there as a stringer to shake up things. He's getting paid. That's all he cares about. He doesn't realize the bigger implications of what he's doing.
So here is the score on the identification of the man who came to the embassy. Oscar Contreras' description of the man who appeared on the campus of the university eliminates Lee Harvey Oswald. The fact that the individual calling himself Oswald spelled the name supports the notion of an imposter. Consul Azcue says the man who started a row with him inside the Cuban embassy wasn't Oswald. Consul Mirabal, who saw Oswald only fleetingly, nonetheless says it was Oswald. Sylvia Duran is a draw. Although she first claimed it was Oswald, albeit blonde and short, her description of the man who was in close proximity to her longer than any of the others is more at odds with the appearance of the real Oswald than the descriptions supplied by Azcue and Contreras. Additionally, in 1978 or 79, in a meeting with Anthony Summers, and this can be found on page 376 of Conspiracy, Duran claimed that the only post-assassination photo she had seen of Oswald was in a Mexican newspaper. Summers sent Duran other photographs and film footage of Oswald. She told Summers, quote, "I was not sure if it was Oswald or not. The man on the film is not like the man I saw in Mexico City. Other questions about the bona fides of Duran still persist."
Okay, did anybody else want to make a comment before we go on to the next point? Next question? And looking at the time, too, I'd like to, we still got 3 more of these to go through. Let's try to speed up a little bit because we need to have at least 30 minutes for questions and answers. The third question is, how did Oswald, which we kind of got into a minute ago, how did Oswald manage to avoid detection by surveillance cameras on all 5 of his alleged visits to the 2 different embassies? And I'd like to call on Gaten Fonte.
Shortly after the assassination, American couriers flew from Mexico City to Dallas and Washington, D.C. to deliver what was originally described as surveillance photos of Oswald. supposedly taken as he was entering and departing the Cuban and Russian embassies. Also, in the evidence were transcripts of tape recordings of his voice, allegedly picked up by electronic eavesdropping devices planted in both embassies. That so-called evidence touched off one of the most suspicious and disturbing controversies of the Kennedy assassination investigation. And the debate is still going on because the photos were of an individual who bore no resemblance to Lee Harvey Oswald. The authenticity of the recordings of Oswald's voice is in grave doubt. In his November 23, 1963 memo to the head of the Secret Service, FBI Director Hoover wrote, "Special agents of this Bureau who have conversed with Oswald in Dallas, Texas, have observed photographs of the individual referred to above and have listened to a recording of his voice. These special agents are of the opinion that the above referred to individual was not Lee Harvey Oswald." The Bureau told the House committee that Hoover's reference to a recording was a mistake, born of confusion. The FBI said they were just reading transcripts. The explanation for that came from Gordon Shanklin, who was in charge of the Dallas office. And as you know, Shanklin was the same individual, FBI official, who ordered the destruction of a note which Oswald had delivered to the FBI shortly before the assassination. Anthony Summers had a recent interview with former FBI Supervisor Lawrence Keenan, and that's also troubling. Sent to Mexico City to head the FBI and CIA's investigation of Oswald's activities, his efforts were greeted with lip service. He returned to Washington totally frustrated. The investigation, he told Summers, was window dressing, and the mention of conspiracy was enough to place a man's career in jeopardy. Surveillance photos, it was later learned, were taken by CIA operatives who had both embassies covered during normal business hours. The problem, of course, was that the photographs were not of Lee Harvey Oswald. The inevitable question was soon raised. Since photographic surveillance encompassed taking pictures of everyone who came in and out of the embassies, why could the CIA not produce photographs of Oswald? And since the so-called transcripts were, as Hoover's memo points out, a recording and the voice not that of Lee Harvey Oswald, whose voice was it? The Mexico City report partially unravels another anomaly. After the contents of an Oswald telephone call to the...
Again, we just read where Maurice Bishop, David Atlee Phillips was talking about that whole process, okay, that they had people at the Russian embassy there, or excuse me, at the in Mexico City, that would record the tapes. Then someone would bring the tapes to the embassy, and then someone would hand out those tapes to someone in the embassy, and they would transcribe them. So they would have listened to the tapes, okay? So it doesn't make any sense they would have only just a transcription.
The Soviet embassy on October 1st was reported to the CIA headquarters in Langley. The agency cabled the Mexico City station identifying this individual as Lee Henry Oswald.
Oh, actually, I got to stop here and go on to the embassy here because I'm over my time. Hold on one second. All right, so we're going to look at the, there's no North Korean embassy in Canada. I guess they don't have any diplomatic relations, which, you know, sometimes Canada will have relationships with countries that the U.S. doesn't, and the CIA will use that as a backdoor. But anyway, so this is the embassy of Venezuela, which is kind of an ally of Russia and Iran and Cuba. And they're just right around the corner from the Russian embassy. They're at that park there. So we'll take a look at that. That's kind of the God's eye view. So we'll take a look at the pictures that they have listed here. Hold on one second. It looks like just a house. It doesn't look like there's very much, what would you say, security. And that means that the Venezuelans don't think they have any enemies in Canada. or their enemies can't get to them in Canada. But they're going to have standard, I'm sure this is some kind of bomb-proof door. I'm sure there are cameras everywhere. This was probably the visa. Yeah, see, they got cameras there. This is the visa door that people would come and get visas. Look at the icicles. Whew, would not want to live in Canada. Yeah, there's the bust of Boulevard. There's the flag. Haven't seen a fence yet, but we'll see. There's something in Spanish here, probably visa request. Something regarding that. Hold on one second. Yeah, it's all in Spanish. Another picture of the bust of Bolivar and the Venezuelan flag. That photo again. The instructions for getting a visa, more of the front part of the embassy. Yeah. Doesn't look like, yeah, there's, well, they got a long visa line, but no security. Yeah, wow, it's a really long visa line. So what that tells me is that the Venezuelans don't think they have any enemies or any threats from enemies in Canada. And we saw the same thing in Mexico City. They had a little bit more security there, but, you know, not a lot. But they did manage to get a secure brick type building. I'm sure most of these windows are bulletproof and bomb proof and stuff. So that's good. But, you know, common sense would tell you to put up some kind of fence there. But, you know, so they don't feel there is a threat to them. Yeah, there's the long walkway. Yeah, see, there's the front. No security whatsoever. I'm sure they've got cameras. And they probably have a patrol of the RMCP go by. But still, just basic common sense would think you put up a damn fence or something. Ooh, nicely shoveled walkway. Still, you can pay me to live in Canada. It's a beautiful place, but whew, too damn cold. Too damn cold. You know, you got snow on the ground from October to April. No thank you. So this one's going to go pretty quick. There's not a lot here. More people waiting in line for visas. Okay, now we're down to Street View. But let me go back here. Hold on one second. Yeah, next door to the Moroccan embassy. I guess that's what the Sri Lankan embassy or commission. Across the street from a park. There's the embassy of Burkina Faso. That's an African country. Yeah, so not a lot. Again, I would have just some kind of fence, at least some kind of fence there. But, oh, and they're listing as a hotel? Interesting. Anyway, let's take a look here. They're not all winners, you know what I'm saying? But yeah, that tells you they don't think they have any enemies. Is that a cab? It's either a cab or a cop. Now the RCMP will put cameras up on these streets and maybe even post a guy down at the end of these streets. That way he can be there on call. This is the Moroccan embassy right there. A nice little park. You can go running in. But still, whew, I just couldn't deal with the cold. It's just too much. But yeah, nice little house. They bought him a nice little house and have their embassy. You can see they got camera there. Probably another camera up here somewhere. But yeah, you know, that's it is what it is. Nice manicured lawn. But okay, so that's it. And next one we'll do next time. Let's see. We'll go over the Nicaraguan embassy in Ottawa if they have one. All right, take care, and we'll see you next time.